Hello there, my name's Mike Talty and I work for Microsoft in the UK, and this is one of a number of short videos on the ActiveTouch site about Silverlight, which is Microsoft's rich internet application technology. Now, this is not the first video on the site. It's not a kind of overview or something like that. If you want something more a bit like an overview, we did do a video a bit like that. So if you went to bit.ly/ActiveTouch intro, then there's a little bit more of an overview there. What I want to do in this video is take a bit of a look at control templating, which is a really powerful feature of Silverlight, and we'll take a look at how that works. And in order to do that, we'll look at it in Expression Blend, which is our design tool. So in order to get started with this stuff, you'll need some tooling installed. Probably the best thing to do is you could go out to silverlight.net get started, and you can download the Silverlight tooling from there. You can get a free version of Visual Studio, you can get the SDK and all the different things that you might need. And here I'm going to use purely Expression Blend. So to get a copy of Expression Blend, you can go out to http://microsoft.com expression, and on there you'll find Expression Blend 4, and you can get a free trial download of that to install on Windows. So if you've got the bits that you get from here, and you've got the bits that you get from there, specifically Expression Blend, you don't need any of the other Expression products, then we'll go and take a look at this notion of control templating in Silverlight applications. Okay, so I'm here in Expression Blend, and if it looks a bit different to yours, it's just because I've got the light theme on mine. You can also have a darker theme that makes it look a little bit different. And you can lay out the windows in different ways. There's lots of different panels in Blend, and you can drag and drop them around the surface, so you can play around and move them around and so on. And so I've just got mine positioned in a particular way. And if you're ever in Blend and you're wondering where one of these windows that I've got on the screen has disappeared to, you can always go to the Window menu and switch on or off as many of the windows as you like. So what we're going to talk about here is this notion of control templating. So I don't really need a complex project for that. Let's just make a new Silverlight application here, and we can call it anything we like. And Blend will pop open the design surface. And let's just let that come up and blank. I can hit Control and 0 just to size that down, or zoom it manually down here if I want to. And let's take a look at this idea of templating. It's a very, very powerful idea, and it applies to pretty much all of the controls that we have available to us inside of Silverlight. And the basic idea, let's take a simple control like this checkbox here, and we'll just go and draw one of those out on the design surface. And I'll zoom into it a little bit so you can see it a little bit better. Let me just perhaps size it differently because it's got a bit bigger than it needs to be. Let's just make sure that it automatically sizes itself the way we want it to do. And so the thing about this, if you take a look at it, is that it's a very simple common user interface control, a checkbox. Everyone's familiar with what a checkbox looks like. It has this little rounded rectangles over here on the left where we can put a check mark. In fact, we could put that check mark in there by just setting the isCheck property in the designer, and we can see there's the check mark. And it has, in this particular case, a piece of text over to the right hand side. I just want to make a point about that piece of text. In Silverlight, there is no reason why that needs to be a piece of text. The checkbox actually has a property called content, and into that property content you don't have to put text. You could put anything. You could put a picture, you could put a video. Silverlight controls can display arbitrary content, and we'll see this a little bit as we go along. However, the important thing from the point of view of this video about this checkbox is that the look and feel of the checkbox, the fact that the text is placed over here to the right, or the content is placed over here to the right, the fact that we have these little rectangles and so on, the fact that if the checkbox is disabled, which I can just check like that, it goes kind of grey, it gets a little bit less opaque. If it's enabled, we bring that back. All of those things are replaceable with a control like a checkbox, and pretty much all the other controls that we have in the framework. We're really just using a checkbox here as an example. And as a designer or a developer, this gives you an awful lot of flexibility. And the way in which we can replace the look and feel of a control is through a property that we call its template. And the way you edit that in Blend is, there's a number of different ways to do this, by the way, but one way we can do it is go here and edit the template. We can either make an empty template or edit a copy. So we'll edit a copy of the current template. I always find that really useful because it shows me how the control is currently made up. So let's take a look at that copy of that template. So this is just giving a resource to contain that We talked about resources in another one of the videos, but this is just making a resource. That's kind of by the by in some ways. And what we're now doing is we are no longer on the design surface playing with the checkbox control. We are now inside the template of the checkbox control. And you'll notice that over here on the Objects and Timeline panel, what we're saying is that this checkbox is made up of fundamentally a grid, and in that grid there's another grid on the left hand side, and then there's this thing on the right hand side called a content presenter. Now this turns out to be really useful because I said before that a Silverlight control can contain arbitrary content. And that's a bit weird, and it takes a bit of getting your head around. If a control can contain arbitrary content, what actually displays that content? Well, we have this special control called a content presenter, and its job, as the name suggests, is to present content. It becomes very useful anywhere in a control where you want to just present something and you don't really know what it is until the user uses your control. You use a content presenter, and that's really what's going on here. So we've got the content presenter on the right, we've got the grid on the left, and inside that grid you'll notice there's all kinds of pieces that make up this humble checkbox control. So there's some kind of background rectangle, and there's the icon for check. You can see it kind of popping in and out there. Let me just zoom that. You can see the icon is there. There's the indeterminate icon because of course a checkbox can be checked, unchecked, or not quite sure. There's a disabled visual element. There's an element for when the checkbox has the focus, and there's some stuff around validation. So all of these things are currently part of the makeup of this standard checkbox. And also what we have over on the states panel over here are all the states that make sense to the checkbox. So for instance, it would usually be in the normal state, but sometimes it's in the mouse over state. Sometimes it's in the press state. Sometimes it's in the disabled state. Normally it would be unchecked, but it can also be checked or indeterminate. It might not have the focus, it might have the focus. And so you can see that this checkbox is made up of these pieces over here that are displayed differently depending on the states that the checkbox is currently in. And these states are actually grouped. The way this works is that basically the checkbox can be in any one of these states from this group and any one of the states from this group, and so on. Groups are kind of mutually exclusive. And so this gives us an awful lot of power, because what we can do as designers or developers is completely rip and replace the feeling of this existing control. We can just get rid of its look and feel and replace it with something else. You might notice that I've gone into state recording mode here, which I didn't really want to do at the moment. So let's simplify this then. Let's start off normally where I would like to start is let's get rid of the whole thing. So I'm just going to hit the delete key on that grid, and now my checkbox displays nothing. Okay, so we better put something back in there. So into this template, let me just size this down a little bit. I want to put, say, a grid. So let's just find a grid. That will be the root of my layout. So I've got a grid in there, and I'm just going to zoom this out a little bit so I can sort of see it over here. By the way, I'm working in Blend at a very low resolution for the screen recording. Generally speaking, you want to get these panels off onto second monitors and so on, or at least get a high-res monitor. So if you think I'm struggling around the UI a little bit, it's because it's at very low resolution for me. It becomes quite hard to use. So we've got a grid over here. Let's imagine that I want my checkbox to look slightly differently from the one we saw before. Let's put a column into the grid, and on the left-hand side here, I want to display the content of the checkbox, whatever that may be. So I'll use one of those content presenters. So let's find one of those, a content presenter. And I just take that and drag it, or in fact if I just double click my grid I can just double click the content presenter and it goes straight in there. And notice that the content has automatically come kind of straight through. It's already in there and making perfect sense. Let me just make sure I've not got any kind of margins and things on that thing. I don't think I will have. Well, there is a bit of a margin crept in on there, so let's just reset that margin on there and make sure that's okay. So that's fine for the moment. There's my content presenter. And then on the right hand side, let's try and draw something a little bit more different from the checkbox that we had before. On various user interfaces like you see on the Windows Phone, I also see them on OS X, you have these sort of slide buttons that slide from left to right to indicate a checkbox state. And so just as an example, let's try and put something very simple like that together. So we'll just go to this grid on the right hand side, and what I'll do is I'm just going to put a second grid onto the right hand side. So we go to the grid here, we'll find a grid again, and we'll just go and double click that, and we'll just make sure that grid is in column 1 of the parent grid, so it's over on the right hand side, and we'll make sure again it doesn't have any margin around it. So now we have a subgrid over on the right hand side here. Let me just go to that grid, and I'll mark out some columns into that. So I'll have a sort of column there and a column there, and then I'll mark out some rows as well. So we'll just have a row kind of there and a row kind of there. I could do with zooming really at this point, so I'm just going to zoom a little bit so we can focus on that subgrid. And I'm not sure this is going to look quite right, but what we'll do is we'll just go and draw a couple of rectangles. So let's find a rectangle, and we'll draw out a rectangle here. And perhaps, I don't think I'll have margins on it, so let's just draw that rectangle like so. And I think my rectangle has a little bit of rounded corners on it, which does. Now, let me think about the colour of this rectangle. What I might want to do is, my natural thing to do would be to set an explicit colour. But if I set an explicit colour on this rectangle, because it's part of a control template, every time somebody uses my control, they're going to be stuck with the colour that I chose, and that would be rubbish. So what I want to do is give them the choice around using their own colours. And we do that through a notion of a thing called template binding. And the idea of that is that within the controls template, I can refer to properties that will be set by a user on the control. So as an example of that here, let's go and set the fill of this rectangle here to be template bound. Now, a checkbox doesn't have a lot of properties on it relating to its display. It has background, it has border, it has foreground. So just as the example here, I'll use the background colour. So let's use the background colour from the control. We'll see how that works out later on. Let's then go and draw another rectangle. So let's just go into our grid again, grab the rectangle over here on the tools, and just draw another one here. And I'm just going to select that and just move it out again. So I don't think I'll have much in the way of margin around it. I will perhaps just go and lay it out so it has just a margin of 1 all around the edge of it. Okay. And once again, I want to set this to some colour. So it's fill, I'm going to set to foreground. Again, just because we don't have a lot of choices, I'm going to set that to foreground. So let's just scroll back out a little bit and see how we're getting on. Okay, it's not looking too bad. We've got some problems with it, which we'll come back to and fix as we go along. I want to make sure that these columns on my grid lay themselves out properly. So I'm just going to go to that particular column. Let's zoom back in. I'm just doing that with the mouse menu, by the way, the mouse wheel. And so I select that column. I'd like this to be 1 equal proportion of the grid's width. I'd like this central portion here to be 1 equal portion, and I'd like this last portion here to be 1 equal portion. So I've just kind of laid that out that way. And then vertically, I'd like this row to be, let's say, let's say half. And I'll have this row to be 1. I'm sure I'll regret this sizing. And let's have this row to be half. So I'm just setting that up to have certain sizing, which will scale as the control is redisplayed. And then the other key thing about this is that we still have to support this notion of the checkbox being checked or unchecked. So let's go with the idea that the left-hand side here is unchecked, for argument's sake. And let's go to our states such that we can say, okay, let's define what the checked state looks like. And to define the checked state, all I really need to do is go and find that sub-rectangle, which I think is that one there, find its properties, and we'll move it into grid column 2, which is over there. So we just move its grid column to move it over there. And so now if I look at my states, I've got unchecked and I've got checked. I'm not going to deal with indeterminate here. I suppose I could put the thing in the middle. I guess we could do that. Actually, let's do that. Let's put the thing in the middle for unchecked. I'm not sure this would be very usable, but let's do it anyway. Let's go to its properties and say, okay, in the indeterminate state, you are in the middle. That's my indeterminate state. And let's go back to our state. So we've got checked, unchecked, and indeterminate. I probably want the control to have some feeling of a transition between those states. So what I could do is set up a transition duration here, let's say of ½ a second. Let's set up an easing function on that to make it feel kind of smooth. So it'll just apply an easing function between the two. I need to switch on a couple of things. I switch on this setting here for fluid layout. That's because of the properties that we're animating. And up here I can tell the designer to preview those transitions. And so as we go checked to unchecked, you can see how that's now working out as that rectangle moves around within its parent. So notice that I am completely replacing the look and feel of this checkbox control with my own slightly arbitrary UI. And I'm not writing any code to do this, I'm just defining the states and the user interface pieces that make this thing up. Now, I might also want to support the notion of the control being disabled. So for instance, let's go to our grid over here, and let's just say that in the disable state, let's go to the properties for the whole grid and just set the opacity down on that. So let's just ramp down the opacity to say, I don't know, maybe 50%, something like that. And now we go back to our states and we can see that normal looks like this and disabled looks like that. Normal and disabled kind of looks like that. So pretty simple to kind of see how that's going on. We could also go and add extra pieces of UI to do things like mouse over, pressed, focused, unfocused. So we would add extra elements to the UI over here and then set them into particular states, particular display states, as and when these things are changing. So we could do that kind of stuff. I won't do it here, but we could add lots more complexity around reflecting all these different states that we've got. Let's just go out of the template. So in Blend, that means clicking this header here. And what we're now in is we're back in our main UI where we are a user of the checkbox. We are not designing the template of the checkbox. So let's take a look at what it means now to be a user of this checkbox. Let's have a look at how it sizes itself firstly. So let's just go up here and let's resize this control. And I can see that, you know, it's not bad in terms of the way it resizes control. It's not too bad. It sizes reasonably nicely. And the content, though, is not really laid out nicely. So let's go to the properties and see where that's coming from. Let's look for alignment in here. And you see that there's two properties that control alignment. There's the alignment of this control itself, but there's this stuff called content alignment. And probably vertically I want my content to be in the center, and horizontally I perhaps want it to be in the center. But you might notice that that's not really working out. This piece of text here is not doing what I wanted it to do. So I've obviously got something wrong in the template. Let's go back into the template and edit that and see what's going on. Well, we've got my content presenter here, and I can kind of see what's going on. This is kind of one of the things of the responsibilities of being somebody who's trying to build something that's reusable, because it's not really for us to dictate how the content should align itself. What we should do is fall back to binding to something on the template again. So what we can do is, instead of saying horizontal alignment like this, we could say what we want to use is a template binding to the horizontal content alignment property sort of on the control itself. So we could template bind this, and here we could do the same to vertical content alignment. And so now if we go back from the template, we see the content is aligning itself the way I want it to. And as a user of this control, I can now change that to be left, or stretch, or right, or center. So as a user of a control, I set this property, and the underlying template is bound to that, so it knows what to do. Excuse me. So let's just see if our control sort of sizes itself a little bit better, see how that's working. So let's have a small version of this control. It's not too bad. Let's have a bigger version of the control. It did seem to stop scaling down at some point. I guess that's inevitable. Bigger version of the control. And I suppose we could test the control. Let's just press F5 in Expression Blend to run the control. Make sure that it actually works in as much as we've made it work. Let's just go and get the test page on the screen here. Where's my controls? Let's just see where my control is. There he is. Let's click. Okay, let's click here. Moves back. Let's click there. Let's click back. So that's working quite nicely. It's not the best checkbox in the world, obviously. And again, in terms of the use of this control, let's copy it. So I'll just go and copy one of those, and let's paste it down here. seem to have lost my my paste command somewhere. Let's just go and paste that down there. So there we have it. And again, we could apply some of those things about template binding. So we go back to our properties for this control, and let's go and say, for instance, on this particular instance over here. Excuse me, I've lost my properties window. Okay, there it is. And we could go back, and I think we're using a couple of brushes in there. So we're using the background. So let's change the background to a gradient, and maybe just have it sort of one of those kind of grey backgrounds with a bit of a gradient on it. Let's just do it something like that. So it's got a kind of gradient on it. And the foreground we're using as well within the control. So let's change that to some other kind of gradient. Let's just start off with some kind of black and go to a darker black in the middle. Let's make another one that kind of the same, and then down at the bottom we go to a lighter colour somewhere down. Oops, excuse me. A lighter colour down at the bottom somewhere down there. So because we picked up that stuff from template binding, we can change the control's colours, and it's picked up by the underlying template, which makes the idea of the control much more reusable. Even though we've changed its look and feel, it's still reusable. And just the last point around content, so at the moment what we've got is just a piece of text in there, but we can have any content we want. So if we want, say, a shape, like let's say, let's go and just get some arbitrary piece of UI. So maybe this arrow or something. It's just a shape. We draw that out. Let's change its properties so it's nice and blue. It's just to rotate it around that way, something like that. And we can make this the content of that control. So if we just hit Alt at this point, it becomes the control's content at that point. And I noticed that perhaps our control isn't displaying that as well as it could. Let's make sure that the arrow doesn't have any kind of margins around it. I'm just going to auto size that arrow. And of course specify its alignment from the point of view of excuse me, content alignment. So let's just go to the checkbox and make sure that this is stretching the arrow, so we see how that stretches up. And that's okay, that's kind of displaying that content in an arbitrary way. Again, we should be able to sort of size the control differently, and it scales reasonably. I've not done a perfect job on that scaling, but it's not too bad. So there's lots more that you can do here, but hopefully you get the idea that for a control, in this case we chose a checkbox, we can go and edit its template. So now I've got this template for a checkbox, and I've changed the way it's made up, but I've managed to maintain the consistency about having a set of states, like when it's checked and when it's not checked and so on. I've got transitions between those states, and I can also even do this notion of template binding such that properties that are set on the control are available to the template as I'm building it. And we've also got this notion about presenting arbitrary content and a special control, the content presenter, to help us with that. And back in my application now, I've got this notion of one way of displaying a checkbox, but of course I can still use the traditional way of displaying a checkbox like that. That's another one. And if I want to switch between the two, I can simply walk up to this one and change its template by applying the resource that I've already built, and now it becomes one of those other kind of checkboxes, as you can see. So hopefully you get that idea about how powerful this can be. You can replace the look and feel of pretty much every control that you come across, and they have templates for their UI components and their states that they move through. That's all part of that template. And sometimes they also have sort of sub-templates within them as well. We haven't really seen that here, but hopefully you do get a flavour as to how this stuff works.